The dream didn't involve champagne on yachts or spa treatments in Bali. It was simpler, quieter, and far more sacred. It was about healing, about family, about making something whole again. Margot Hale had spent 4 years piecing together the perfect trip, not for herself, but for her son Dean, his wife Rachel, their 2 young daughters, and even Rachel's elderly parents. It was to be the kind of vacation people talked about for years. A chance to reconnect, to laugh, to be human again. She cut corners on her own life to make it happen. Swapped salon appointments for home haircuts. Stitched up old shoes instead of buying new ones. Brown-bagged lunches while her coworkers ordered lattes and sandwiches. And every time she dropped a $10 bill into the cookie jar behind the flour tin, she whispered to herself, "This will be worth it." Every sacrifice was stitched with intention. Margot booked flights for 7, a seaside cottage in Maine with creaky wooden floors and an old porch swing, and scheduled a sailboat tour at sunset. She even selected hypoallergenic linens for Rachel's mother's arthritis and packed small keepsake boxes for the girls engraved with, "You are deeply loved." This wasn't a vacation, it was Margot's legacy. Then, 2 days before departure, a message from her son arrived, one that would unravel everything she believed about love, family, and where she belonged in the story she thought she had written. Asterisk Margot Hale had never been to Maine. She'd only seen it in postcards and magazine spreads, rocky coastlines, lighthouses, pine forests, whispering in the ocean breeze. But something about it called to her, a place far enough from the everyday noise, yet close enough to feel like home. The kind of place a fractured family might just find its rhythm again. Dean had always loved the water. As a boy, he would drag sticks along the edge of the creek behind their house, pretending he was a sea captain on a grand voyage. Margot used to watch him from the kitchen window, heart swelling at his imagination, never once thinking the waves between them would grow so wide. After his father passed away, things shifted. Dean got quieter. Then came Rachel, brilliant, composed, and always a little distant. Margot did her best to connect, offering help, showing up for birthdays, sending cards. But the effort always felt one-sided. Rachel thanked her, smiled politely, and then quietly placed boundaries that Margot never fully understood. Still, Margot held on to hope that one day they'd sit at a table not just as relatives, but as family. So she planned quietly, steadily, for 4 years. She started a spreadsheet called Project Lighthouse, a name only she knew. It had columns for airfare, rental cottages, food preferences, allergies, entertainment for the kids, even rain day contingencies. She researched, down to the brand of pillows best for arthritis and the scent of soap Rachel's mother once said she liked. Nothing was too small. Nothing was too much. She worked late shifts at the library, shelving books until her knees ached. She declined dinners, skipped birthday lunches with friends. Every $10 or $20 she saved went into the jar. She kept a sticky note inside the lid that read, "It's not about the trip. It's about the chance." It wasn't a chance for herself. It was a chance for Dean to remember who he was with her, for Rachel to feel cared for the grandkids to know their grandmother beyond holiday cards and polite hellos. It was her final attempt to hold together a tapestry that had slowly been coming apart. One chilly March morning, she booked it all. A whitewashed cottage near Kennebunkport with a view of the Atlantic. A wooden swing on the porch. A kitchen big enough for shared meals. She added a sailboat tour and a reservation at a lobster shack famous for hand-drawn menus. 7 tickets, including hers, paid in full. She even splurged on handmade bracelets for her granddaughters. To Ella, braver than the wind. To Lucy, stronger than the tide. She imagined the moment they'd arrive, suitcases rolling over. Gravel kids running to choose bedrooms. Rachel smiling in surprise at the detail. Maybe, just maybe, it would thaw the years of cold politeness. That night, Margot sat alone at her kitchen table, a mug of chamomile steaming at her elbow. The confirmation emails were printed, neatly clipped, and sorted into a folder labeled Family Trip, June. She smiled as she slipped the folder into her carry-on next to the old photo of her and her late husband. laughing on the beach in '89. That photo always brought her luck. She went to sleep that night feeling full. Hopeful. She didn't know yet that everything she'd built was about to collapse with the tap of a finger. Asterisk, 2 days before the trip, Margot was up early, folding laundry with the kind of gentle care usually reserved for newborns. Each item going into her suitcase had been chosen with love linen shirts. Her favorite sandals, a wide-brimmed hat she'd found at a thrift store and patched herself. And tucked neatly in a silk pouch was the floral sundress she'd worn on her 25th anniversary. The one with tiny embroidered daisies that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets. Her suitcase sat by the door, zipped and ready, on the table. Beside it was the folder labeled Family Trip June, now holding printed boarding passes and color-coded itineraries. Everything was in order. Everything was perfect. The only thing missing was a message from Dean. He hadn't called. Neither had Rachel. Margot told herself they were just busy packing, chasing the girls, tying up loose ends before travel. Still, a part of her itched with unease. At 11:42 a.m., her phone buzzed. Dean. Finally, she smiled and unlocked the screen. But instead of a warm check-in or a "can't wait to see you," she read, "Mom, I need to tell you something before the trip. Please don't take this the wrong way. Rachel and I have been thinking, and we feel like this vacation should be just for our side of the family. Rachel's parents, the girls. We want it to be a chance for them to bond. You've already done so much. You paid for everything, and we're really grateful. But we think it's best if you don't come." Margot stared at the message, her thumb frozen above the screen. She read it again, then again. "We think it's best if you don't come." It didn't compute. This had to be a mistake. It's terrible miscommunication. Her first instinct was to call, to ask why, to try and fix it. But then she read the words again. "You've already done so much. You paid for everything." That was it. No apology, no explanation of what she meant to them. No acknowledgement of the years she had spent building this moment from scratch. She wasn't invited. Not anymore. Just like that, Margot didn't cry. Not at first. She simply set the phone down on the table, gently, as if it were made of glass. The room around her, her modest kitchen, her ticking wall clock, the half-made cup of tea suddenly felt like a museum of someone else's life. One she no longer fit into. She sat at the table in silence for a long time. Hands folded in her lap like a child waiting to be spoken to. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was just hollow. When the tears finally came, they didn't crash like a wave. They trickled slowly, as if even her sadness couldn't quite believe this was happening. She thought of the bracelets, the ones she had tucked into gift bags for Ella and Lucy. Braver than the wind, stronger than the tide. Who would hand those to them now? Would Rachel even give them out? Or would they be discarded, the engraving too painful to keep? She imagined Rachel's mother sleeping on the hypoallergenic pillows she'd specially ordered without knowing who had picked them out. She imagined Dean walking past the bedroom she would have stayed in, the one with the sunrise view, where she'd planned to drink her coffee each morning, and most of all, she imagined her own absence being treated as convenience, not a loss, not a regret, just easier. She rose from the table, walked over to her suitcase, and unzipped it slowly. She pulled out the dress, the lavender-scented one. Her fingers lingered on the fabric for a long time before she folded it back up and placed it on the bed. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and listened to the night sounds of her neighborhood. The rustle of leaves, a distant dog barking, the rhythm of her own heart trying to make sense of everything. At some point, she whispered to the wind, "I gave them everything." And in that whisper came something else, faint but real. "And maybe it's time I gave something to myself." At dawn, Margot stood in her kitchen, bathed in pale light. The clock above the sink ticked steadily, unchanged, uncaring. Her suitcase still sat by the door, zipped tight like a secret. Her teacup from the night before remained untouched. She looked around the room, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like hers again. Not a waiting room for someone else's love. Not a shrine to a family that no longer saw her. Just as Margot picked up her phone and opened the spreadsheet titled Project Lighthouse. The numbers stared back. $21,476.83. Every digit a memory. A missed dinner, a patched heel, a night spent dreaming of reunion instead of rest. She hovered, her finger over the freeze account button her bank app offered. It would lock the funds, prevent her from touching them until she figured out what came next. She tapped .frozen. She closed the spreadsheet and opened a blank document. For a long moment, the screen blinked a blank canvas. Then, slowly, she began typing names. Helen, Ruth, June, Clara, Anita. They weren't relatives. They were women she knew from the library, the grocery store, the quiet rows of folding chairs at Sunday service. Women who had spent decades giving everything to everyone else and now found themselves quietly fading in the margins of their own lives. Helen, 72, who had raised 3 children alone and now spent holidays making cookies for neighbors who rarely knocked. Ruth, 68, who still wore her wedding ring, even though her husband had passed 9 years ago, just so people would stop asking if she was seeing someone. June, 65, whose daughter hadn't called in for months, but still sent her a scented candle on Mother's Day. Clara, 71, who once whispered over tea, "It's like I disappeared without dying." And Anita, 69, who smiled with her lips but not her eyes. Margot looked at the list and felt something shift. These women weren't sad stories, they were resilience incarnate. And for the first time, she saw herself reflected not in the empty seat at her son's table, but in the company of women who had survived and still offered warmth to the world. She stood up, took a breath, and reached for the phone. The first call was to Helen. "Hi," Margot said, unsure if her voice would hold. "I know this is out of the blue, but how would you like to go to Maine with me?" A pause. Then, "Maine. I've booked a house on the coast, plenty of room, no expectations. Just you, me, and maybe a few others, women like us." Helen, didn't speak for a long while. Then she let out a soft, stunned laugh. "You're serious? I'm tired of waiting for people to see me. I'd rather see people who've been there all along." Helen whispered, "Yes, God, yes." Margot smiled for the first time in days. Next came Ruth, then Clara, then Anita. Each one hesitated, laughed nervously, said yes, like someone who hadn't said yes to herself in years. By the end of the day, Margot had rebooked the trip. New names, same destination, different purpose. She changed the label on the folder from family trip. June to second sunrise, there would be no matching shirts, no family photos staged at sunset. No schedule packed to please others. Just 6 women, seasoned by life, choosing joy not as a reward, but as a right. She selected a smaller cottage, still by the sea, still with a porch, but cozier. She replaced the gift bags with hand-knit scarves, each one stitched with a word. Free, brave, seen, whole, still. Enough. She packed her lavender dress again, not for anyone else to admire, but because she still felt beautiful in it. On the night before they left, Margot sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the stars blink into place. She didn't feel bitter. She didn't feel small. She felt beginning. The story she had tried to write the perfect reunion, the healed family, was over. This was a new story now, one where she didn't wait to be chosen. She chose herself. Asterisk, the cottage wasn't perfect. The floors creaked. The kitchen faucet had a slow drip. The living room smelled faintly of salt and old books. But to Margot, it was paradise. Perched on a bluff above the Maine coastline, the house overlooked endless blue. Waves thudded against the rocks like a steady heartbeat, and gulls danced in the wind overhead. The porch wrapped around the house like a gentle arm, and every morning, sunlight spilled through the windows like an invitation. Helen arrived first, dragging a worn suitcase with stickers from decades-old trips. Paris, Venice, San Diego, hope. You don't snore, she teased, only when I'm content. Margot grinned. Then came Ruth, carrying 2 crocheted shawls and a book of poetry. Clara and Anita carpooled in Clara's old Volvo, both wearing sunglasses too big for their faces and grins too wide for their age. And finally, June, late, flustered but beaming. She held up a pie in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. This is all I know how to bring, she said. You brought yourself. That's more than enough, Margot replied. The first night, they sat around the dining table eating takeout lobster rolls off paper plates, their silver hair glowing gold in the candlelight. No one checked their phones. No one said grace out loud, but there was gratitude in every breath. The conversation was light at first. Recipes, movies, grandkids, arthritis, meds. But as the wind howled gently outside and the fire crackled low, the truth began to emerge. I was so scared to come, Clara admitted. I thought I didn't belong anywhere anymore. Anita nodded. I spent years being useful. Then one day, no one needed me, and I didn't know who I was without that. I used to think, Helen said, that if I kept giving, eventually someone would notice. Turns out, I was disappearing in the process. Ruth placed her hand over Helen's. We're here now. That counts for something. It did. Each morning, they drank coffee on the porch wrapped in quilts, watching the sea foam dance against the cliffs. Some afternoons, they walked along the shore, picking up smooth stones and heart-shaped shells. Other days, they sat in silence, side by side, reading novels or knitting or simply breathing. No one asked for explanations. No one judged the pauses or the tears that came without warning. On the third night, Margot brought out the scarves she had made, one for each of them, carefully folded and wrapped in brown paper. They opened them slowly, like sacred things. Helen's scarf reads seen, Ruth's still, Clara's brave, Anita's enough, June's free. Margot's own scarf simply read whole. They wore them for the rest of the evening, bundled in warmth, sipping wine as the stars emerged above the waves. It wasn't a grand vacation. There were no selfies for social media, no dramatic reunions, no luxury experiences. But something inside each of them shifted, healed, stood taller. On their final night, they lit a small fire on the beach. Margot placed the framed photo of her and her husband next to the flames, not to mourn, but to share. He would have loved this, she thought, these women. This piece. As the fire cracked, they told stories, real ones, of first loves, of mistakes, of regrets, and quiet victories. Laughter echoed down the shore. It was the kind of joy that came not from perfect moments, but from being truly seen later. Margot stepped away from the fire, walked to the edge of the water, and stood alone for a while. The wind pulled at her scarf, and the tide reached for her toes. For the first time in a long time, she felt chosen, not by others, by herself. Margot returned home 2 days after the others. The house greeted her with silence, as always. But this time, it felt less like loneliness and more like space open, uncluttered hers. She unpacked slowly, folded the scarf marked whole, and placed it in the top drawer of her nightstand. The stones from the beach went into a ceramic bowl by the window, catching light like tiny memories. The photo of her and Daniel, slightly singed by the firelight, found a new frame and a new spot on the bookshelf. Not a shrine, but a chapter. The ache was still there, of course. Family doesn't stop mattering just because it breaks your heart. Dean hadn't called. Neither had Rachel. The girls probably didn't even notice she was gone. Or maybe they were told something else entirely that used to crush her, but now it stung. Yes. But it didn't define her. On the third morning, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Just her name in a careful, familiar handwriting. Inside was a child's drawing. Stick figures holding hands, standing by what looked like a house with a swing. Above it, written in clumsy red crayon, "Grandma, I miss you. Why didn't you come?" and in smaller writing beneath it, likely added by a parent. She had other plans. Margot smiled softly, tears blurring the edges of the page. She folded it gently and tucked it behind the mirror. Other plans. Indeed, she spent the next weeks differently. She joined a book club at the local library, started taking long walks in the park, often stopping to sketch things she hadn't noticed before. Crooked fences, dandelions in bloom, old couples holding hands. She even said yes to coffee when June invited her to meet the others at a nearby cafe. They became regulars. 6 women in scarves, always laughing too loudly, tipping generously, and occasionally crying when someone mentioned something that mattered. No one judged. One afternoon, as she watched them gather around a table, bickering about who would cover the bill, Margot realized something that made her breath catch. She hadn't just survived being excluded from her family's plans. She had built a new one, a family of women who had once felt discarded, who now carried each other forward, not out of obligation, but choice. That night, Margot sat on her porch, cup of tea in hand, wrapped in her scarf. The wind rustled, the wind chimes. The world moved on, and she sat quietly, not needing to hold it all together anymore. She was no longer the woman begging to be included in someone else's story. She was writing her own asterisk. If you've ever planned something with all your heart only to be left behind, if you've ever given love, time, or hope to someone only to be told you're not part of it, then maybe, like Margot, you know what it means to start over. This story isn't just about one woman left out of a vacation. It's about what we do with the hurt. It's about choosing healing, even when an apology never comes. And it's a quiet reminder that your story doesn't end just because someone else closed their chapter. So if this story touched something inside you, maybe a memory, maybe a regret, maybe a piece of yourself you've been trying to reclaim, let us know in the comments, because you're not alone. And if you know someone who's been quietly giving, quietly waiting, quietly fading into the background, share this video with them. Let them know they're seen. Subscribe to Real Moments for more stories that speak to the things we all carry but rarely say out loud, because sometimes a story like this is more than just a story. It's a lifeline. Thank you for watching, and remember, even when others leave you out, you still belong to yourself. Asterisk.